David, it's great to see you. I,
Yeah.
I love the color of the wall behind you. It's like it's such a I mean, it's spring here now, and the color is so evocative in
Yeah.
such a way.
Well, I put a little display of your work and one of my pieces just to create a little reminiscence.
Nice, nice. David, I can hardly believe how many years ago it has been since that summer that we first went. I mean, 1994. It's a long time ago. You know, it's
Yeah,
whoa.
I was 34 years old. I was a young lad.
Wow. And I had just turned 40.
Uh-huh. Well, I arrived via Dublin after staying with Eamon Coleman and his mother.
Staying with Eamon, right?
Yeah, and they were great hosts. And Margot had some business to do in Dublin, so she drove me in her car from Dublin to Ballycastle,
Wow.
and that was one of the most memorable drives because I didn't have to concentrate on a map or uh, navigation, and I could just look out the window. And she was so excited to get to Ballycastle and show this little corner of the world that she and Peter had discovered.
And David, how like can you remember the flavor of that first approach? Like how were you feeling in the car?
Well, I remember that, of course, I'm addicted to ruins. So, there wasn't an isolated stone or pile in the field that didn't have my nose smushed up to the car window glass. But we arrived via the Glen Road, and at maybe a quarter of a mile outside of town, it's a real the land kind of creates a gorge, and there's a really ancient castle called Castle in the Glen with massive walls. I mean, it's a real pile, but you can tell that as a lookout, as a fort, it had a command view of the sea. Uh,
Like
you
straight on to the bay.
Straight onto the bay, so any oncoming enemy could be gleaned. But that was the approach, and then
Wow.
took a right hand turn into the village.
And it's like, wow. So you approached much differently than we did. We came from Killala, because we came in that way. David, if you could just for like sort of a contextual relationship, like who were you visually until that point? Like where were you at? Where were you at in your visual life at that point in 1994? Like if you were to characterize yourself visually, like where like what who were you, arriving in Ballycastle, until that point? Like what were your like interests and concerns?
Well, of course, I was living in Philadelphia, and I was essentially my studio was outdoors, endlessly exploring neighborhoods and a kind of history that had become abandoned, and the post-industrial factory heritage of Philadelphia along the banks of the Southwest Schuylkill. Um, so I was kind of chronicling uh, that that phase of history that was disappearing. So of course it was very urban and didn't begin to have the pristine quality of nature that one was enveloped by upon in Ballycastle. Uh,
Oh, I'm sorry, you looked like you were going to continue the thought I was going
so
to.
I was more focused on concrete man-made objects that had been conditioned by nature. But when I arrived to Ireland, the changeable weather, as they say, was such a uh, an endless force just so all encompassing. You know, one minute the sun would shine, next minute it was pouring rain, whiteouts, tremendous wind, that it kind of beat me down on the first day. It just beat down everything I thought I knew and loved about painting and my subject matter. I mean, the weather lifted me up and shook me out, and broke all my weak limbs.
I had a very, I mean, I used to think that this is what people who are into S&M must be into, you know, like getting the shit beaten out of them. I felt the same way.
I mean, I was scared, actually. I remember going with Pam to Ballina to do shopping with your boys, and of course Nate and Gideon were toddlers. But I kind of needed the comfort of a woman nurturing, because I was so anxious. I mean, I found Ballycastle, it wasn't a comfortable place to be at first. The weather was so aggressive, and it took me a while to calm down and let it take me into its fold.
Yeah. So, you know, that first summer, Gideon hadn't been born yet. Gideon didn't come along until a few summers later. Well, the next summer. So yeah, you went with Nate and Pam.
Yeah.
I know exactly what, I mean, I felt a very similar thing as far as like I felt so small in that landscape, you know, but didn't you find after a while, after you kind of acclimated, didn't you find or discover like a great sense of comfort in that insanity of weather?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was euphoric. Uh, I can close my eyes, remember being along a roadside, and that this incredible smell of combined fragrance of the farmland, and just multiple wildflowers, and the smell of the sea, uh, and the silence, except for farmers on their tractors. But something that you really brought to my attention, that uh, you described, you immediately understood the compression, the compression of this immense space. How this patchwork of farmland in the below the village, and then as it expanded up the hillsides, how it was like an accordion, like, you know, the winds and the clouds just pushed it all together, and that all the buildings were like little grains of salt. I mean, I'm quoting you. And it was, to this day, that is the most apt kind of experience of that space. And it was very, as an artist, it was very hard it was such a subtle punctuation to move your eye through that. It was very deceptive, because you're really looking at a vast, deep perspective. But it was just like, again, you know, it was just pushed together, mushed together.
That's a great description. I mean, the thing is, David, that as many times as we approached and were within that landscape, I never felt like I really fully knew it. Right? Like, I mean, it was so expansive, and we didn't really travel very far, right? Like, we didn't travel. It's not like we were running all around, that it felt like we were on a Monopoly board,
Yeah.
you know, where we had a limited, like we were on an enclosure, like a playing field or a court. Mm-hmm. And no matter where we sat or where we stood, it was always like some incredible mystery opening its arms for us.
Yes, and you wisely often painted over and over and over again the same motif, you know, from, you know, in various lights or shifting moods of, throughout the day, or different angles, like Stella Maris.
Well, that painting you have in the middle on the wall, I must have sat in that spot, I don't know, like 100 times over the years, more, 100 times, 100 times in one summer.
What I think was interesting about that painting, and I paired it with a painting that I did of Rathfren Abbey, the 12th century friary outside of Killala, is I think one of the trappings or deceptive challenges for artists who come to Ballycastle is the cloud structures are so outrageous, they're so formidable that one tends to really overemphasize them. And what's interesting about much of your work is that you that deep anchor of darkness is typically more represented in the foreground, in the earth. For me, in that painting in the middle, it's the earth that is more a reflection of the weight of the sky, and that I mean, not to say that there isn't that same tension and weight in the sky, but you restrained yourself in the most remarkable way in responding to those Irish skies. Where if you look at mine, it's the opposite. I couldn't help myself. I just got caught up in like a whirly dervish in the blackness of the sky with little spotlights.
Yeah, no, it's such an interesting observation, David. I've never really stopped to think about that I was obsessed with the sky, but I always saw the sky as luminous, and that there were darks in the sky. But yes, the earth, and I never thought consciously about this before. The earth was where I often found a weight that was like a counterpoint to the craziness of the sky.
I mean, you could turn your painting upside down and it would still read as an exquisite expression of the sky and earth.
The sky and the earth. I can remember as we approached from Killala. I mean, you remember because you must have gone shopping in Ballina so many times over the time you were there, or even like coming back from someplace. Those first glimpses that we got off to the right at like 1 o'clock as we were driving, those first glimpses of the sea. Remember the road from Killala to Ballycastle? It was such a strange road. I mean, there were no major landmarks, but the landmarks that were there became so significant to us, even if it was some scrubby trees and an old ruin. And I remember the first summer we arrived, as we were driving in from Killala, the first glimpses were like, they were like looking through a kaleidoscope when you're a child, and just like, oh my God, like the color of the sky and the color of the sea and the clouds that were going by, and the sea and the sky was gorgeous, but the sea was like a bowl of crushed blueberries in color, just like a dark blue, ultramarine with some violet, and the weight,
like vest, like your under your sweater, that color.
Yeah, and it was outrageous. It was like a bowl that was under the sky, and the sky was like a powder cerulean blue from Pompeii, like some crazy color.
Well, what I found distinctive about Killala was most of the Irish villages and towns in Mayo, there was more or less a straightaway, on relatively flat land with the houses on either side. But Killala was more like a French or Spanish hill town, in that it was built on a hill overlooking the bay, and the streets, wow, you know, there's sort of a hairpin curve right in the center of the town before you descend out of it. And
That's a
then,
beautiful description. Yeah.
yeah, and then also, of course, again, addicted to ruins. I spent a lot of time at Chomhairle House, which is one of the English landlord houses not too far from Killala. But it was a remarkable setting. It had a command view of Mount Nathan to the west, which you and I climbed. I remember on one occasion. But here you are on the front doorstep of this Georgian landlord house. It's roofless. You know, all the locals pulled off all the roof tiles during the times of the Troubles, and repaired their roadbeds. But from that point, you could look down you saw Mount Nathan, you saw Rathram Friary. Behind the stables was a megalithic ruin of standing stones, and you could also see the round tower in Killala.
Wow.
I mean, all these points of history, just within a 360-degree point of view. I mean, I just was ecstatic.
Beautiful.
I think, you know, linking my experience and vision, my visual encounters of Philadelphia with Ireland, one of my access points with any place I go to is history. And you know, it's and especially when it's conditioned by nature, it's humbled by nature, it's especially exciting to me.
Yeah, and you know, David, I was going to say earlier, but I knew we would get to it eventually when you were talking about who you were as a painter in Philadelphia and kind of how, you know, what you arrived with in terms of your orientation. You know, what I remember about you in Philadelphia was your orientation toward and your appetite for exploring the built environment, you know, like what people had made. And when I looked at the images of yours that are in the collection in Ballycastle, they're both of interiors. And, you know, I remember from the first summer noticing how deeply involved you were. And of course, listening to your stories back then, how deeply involved you were with exploration of interiors, you know, like the cabins. And I mean, it was like we were in the same world together. We were in Ballycastle, but in what seemed like a village, there was this huge range of possibility for a painter. And you chased, you know, you followed yourself into places that I never went, you know, in terms of like where the dangling carrot of your visual passion took you.
Yeah. Well, I think that when I found myself in the area of Kilbride, and I was painting the old schoolhouse, what they call the master's cottage, you know, draped with 12-foot high fuchsia bushes. I mean, in America, you go to Home Depot and fuchsia are in you know, hanging baskets. And I thought, I mean, this was on an overcast day, those, you know, pink carmine and deep purple flowers that look like ballerinas shimmering in that dark light. I'd never seen anything like it. And I was painting this, you know, probably the only two-story structure in, at least below the village in the farmland, the master's cottage, which was a ruin. Michael John Burke appeared with a cup of tea and some crusty bread with jam, and invited me into his farming croft.
This was the first meeting, David?
This was the first meeting, yeah. And from that moment on, I was just besotted with this handsome 72-year-old Irish farmer with these steel gray blue eyes, who embraced my company. And his home, a generational home, I never saw any evidence of plumbing, maybe just a dangling, unadorned light bulb. And the floor was made up of massive paving stones, and of course a little glow from a turf fire, and a encrusted and dusty portrait of JFK.
Wow.
And also, in that darkness was this emerald green hutch with these beautiful willow patterned platters and other things that he would refer to as his mother's death.
His mother's death.
To have the privilege of walking into a time capsule, an interior which somehow reflected a human living, a human residence that was so interlocked with nature, regardless of what culture it was so rare. I mean, there were only the essentials: a teacup, a saucer, a fire, burlap bags of turf, a few woolen socks drying, and a blackened teapot.
He didn't have a wall that was an entertainment center?
He did not. He didn't have a sports bar.
So David, did you think that basically that cottage hadn't changed since his parents or grandparents had lived there?
No, there was even a loft. I mean, hence the meaning farming croft. There was a loft where the animals would be kept during the winter. There was still straw and still halters and lead lines for the animals. And I'll never forget the massiveness of the door, always an extraordinary color from layers and layers and years and centuries of paint. But it was also like split from a little bit of rot from the moisture where it met the threshold, and you could see a little bit of daylight coming through. And that was really the most intense experience of light coming into this dark abode.
Did you paint in the house?
I did. In fact, the painting that Margot and Peter chose is called, I think it's called Chiffonier, which is not exactly a hutch. It's more of a cadenza or sideboard. It was actually it was the most appointed piece of furniture in the house, but it was completely transfigured by the cabinet doors were falling off. But there was one, and there was like a broken porcelain rooster on it, which was, when I think of it, a decisive ornament.
Wow. So it sounds like the patina of time was covered everything like light.
Yeah. It was like a Rembrandt interior, just a liquid darkness poured over every form. And the subtle experiences of light coming in through the windows, which had a grimy film over them from the wood smoke. But and then Margot took you and I to en route to Carataig, which is a whole nother adventure. It's like going to the Wild West. But she took us to a very distinct little isolated ghost town called Shilagi. And she showed us this interior that, again, had that iconic hutch. This one was red, like a blood red color with, again, a few broken pieces of china. And Michael John gave me this milk pitcher.
Wow.
You can see this was as it was, but I love its simplicity. It's so it's just so expressive of the simplicity of what it's meant to do.
Well,
No,
it's so beautiful.
yeah. I think one of the enormous gifts of having experienced Ballycastle in the early mid 90s up to 2000 was that we had the opportunity to meet, to develop relationships with a generation of Irish farmers and who lived so closely to the land and hadn't been yet contaminated by the technological advances or the they had such a remarkable relationship with nature and just living on the land.
We would see men in the fields with scythes. And I'd never heard the sound of a scythe before I went to Ballycastle. Like the sound of a scythe when you're on foot or when you get out of the car and you're walking around and someone is cutting a field with a scythe.
I know, and I think too, one of the things I found so remarkable about someone like Michael John Burke is their support and affection for other local, like especially the neighboring sons, the young men who are taking on the work that he wasn't strong enough to do again. As Americans, we seem so territorial. That's another thing. I don't think I ever asked permission. I wasn't told to run away, but as I waltz across fields with my easel and my greasy paints, I was just met with smiles and kind of curiosity.
Yeah, I remember the idea, like Anne Callahan, used to say, "Oh, just stop in," like stop in, like at midnight to stop in, like it was like another way of life.
Well, Anne Callahan, God bless her, and Sean and
Oh,
Dervla and Seamus and they took very, very good care of me in my last few visits. And it was really remarkable because I chose to set up my studio in her ruin of a carriage house behind the post office. And this was remarkable. It was a second story loft with beautiful stone steps and completely ivy clad, with cobwebs and dust and these little centipedes and these little prehistoric looking bugs I think they're called pill bugs, which curl up in little balls. They're scaly, but for 5 months in this cobwebbed interior with exposed rafters, I would hang up my artwork. It was remarkable.
I remember that place. I remember when you took me there, and it was like, first of all, just entering the courtyard was
Yeah.
like walking back in time.
Yeah, I was begging her to fix it up. Maybe she has by now for her children.
The courtyard, but then going into where you were located, it was absolutely fantastic. It was like opening a door in time and walking into another world. David, did you spend on one of the trips 5 months there?
No. Did I say 5 months? No, I've never spent more than 6 weeks. In actual fact, though, when I would arrive, I'd want to spend the rest of my life there. But it was such an intense relationship that after 5 or 6 weeks, it's in some ways it's unnatural, unreasonable to just go out hunting every day with your paints and having conversations with the landscape, trying to come away with some little truthful reflection of what you saw, but you were exhausted. It was that part of it. If I had to, if I have the good fortune of going back, I want to. Of course, I'm a lot older, but I want to work at a slower pace.
Right. We worked like animals.
We worked like animals. We really did.
We can't do that anymore. I mean,
And
we're old men.
I was kind of embarrassed, but I'd arrive into town with the first morning with my hired car, and all the locals were like, "Look at that shiny little Ford Fiesta," and I would spend about 2 hours outfitting it like an armored tank, and
the plastic.
putting black garbage bags over every upholstered portion, because as you know, I operate like a toxic waste dump.
David, speaking of those cars, do you remember when we used to take paint to cover over paint that we had gotten on the car, like on the upholstery, like painting over the paint with another color so that it would blend with the upholstery?
Yeah, and I remember too, we going down those narrow grassy lanes to achieve some great vista, and the cattle, you'd come back from having painted, and the cattle would have rubbed their rear ends on the the side door mirror, and it'd be dangling from a cord like a pendant. They love scratching their asses on those hired cars.
Well, you probably also would if you were a cow.
Yeah. Speaking of asses, I was equally interested in the salmon fishing boats, what they called half-deckers, and you can remember, like, it's almost like a Beethoven aplomb, Belderrig, the port of Belderrig. I mean, that in itself was just another world. But I can remember painting there, and it was one of the half deckers was completely exposed, so that the hull and the keel, I guess they were working on the boat, but the form, the voluminous form of that hull and exposed keel was to die for, stained by the sea. And one of the fishermen came up to me and said, so you're an us man, are you? Because my focus was not on the upper decks, but on the keel, on the stern of the ship. I thought that was amusing.
Wow. Yeah. And from that point on, the road kind of opened up into what was for me a kind of a fantasy land, right? Like, I mean, the way that the land presented itself to us. Remember with the sheep laying in the road?
I mean, in some ways, I had never at that point, I had never been to the American out west. I have since made road trips, so I've seen it, but that was somehow that expanse, as you say, and the sheep, the laying of the sheep, just emphasized that vast, endless space, and the bog cotton.
The bog cotton, and the way it blew into got caught in everything.
Yeah.
Wow.
And it kind of was a metaphor for the loneliness and the emptiness of that vast space.
But at the same time, the fullness, in a way, right? Like, I never felt like I went into Strawberry Mansion yesterday to visit the demolition site.
And explain the Strawberry Mansion. Was it the neighborhood or the one of the actual historic houses.
So yes, the 18th century house is called Strawberry Mansion, but that's what the neighborhood was called.
Right.
And I went to visit this synagogue that's being demolished, kind of a Moorish style. And I hadn't driven through the neighborhood in years. I used to paint there a long time ago. And it felt so sad. Like the poverty was so extreme, and the buildings were in such a state, and there was a kind of a like the structures, the structures were like crying in a way, like they were hurting. But there was something about the emptiness of the landscape in the West, that it was empty and it was lonely, but it felt like such intense energy, right? Like, just like it was incredibly weird, and it made the body feel very small, but there was something huge and energetic about it.
And I think that's in a nutshell, I think that's what the success of your Irish paintings, or one of the most moving visual encounters that you can have with your repertoire of Irish works, is that fullness, the powerful fullness that fills up that emptiness. I think you really convey that in a remarkable way. It's so tempting for me and so many other painters who I've seen go there to get seduced by the narrative of little buildings and copses of wiry trees, but you go right for that invisible volume.
But David, wouldn't you say, because you as well, I mean, what struck me about the paintings of yours from the first summer, and I remember seeing a wall of your work at the Philadelphia Art Alliance on Rittenhouse Square. Peter and Margot had organized, I think, with
It's a nice show. I think that I really liked that show.
Oh, it was a wonderful show, and there was a nice little catalog. But I remember seeing your work there on the, we each had a wall area. I remember Richard Upton was in the show.
Oh, you remember his drawings?
Oh, his drawings.
Whatever happened to him? Those drawings were spectacular.
But I can remember in that show feeling like your paintings were the result of how you had opened yourself to that place, right? Like, like how you would kind of, you were there, but you just mentioned like how you've seen certain people's work where, they're like painting a cottage and then another cottage. There was something that I understood in your work that was about more than just painting a bunch of stuff that you saw. It was about more than that. It was about, because when we come to a place, I mean, from knowing your work for so many years, I've always felt that, your work kind of reinforced this thought for me that what we're doing is, of course, we bring ourself to a place, but that self is then transformed by the conversation with the place. So the paintings are not about, let me tell you something, like the painting is not about like us telling the painting or telling the place. The process of painting is about being open to total transformation, to the possibility of total unexpected transformation. And that's what I saw in your work in that first summer.
Yeah, well, I definitely, in my youthful enthusiasm, was submitted my entire will to that landscape. And that was one of the benefits of working exclusively outdoors and making multiple paintings, you know, working quickly and wading through, for the most part, my overriding presence, what my personality brought to that place, until I got to a point where maybe I was worn out. It often happened at the end of the day as opposed to the morning, when I had just kind of crossed that threshold and was at the mercy. I had become one with that atmospheric environment, and just enveloped by the mood and tonality, and every sense was engaged. And but those those were wrestling matches, because I'm not Irish, I'm not of that landscape, I'm contaminated by too many experiences. you know
Right, but in a way, what was so interesting, and I'm sure for you, as it was for me, we were both aware that we were not of that landscape, as you just said. Like, we were outsiders, we were like voyeurs, coming to a place. Yet what was most interesting for me was to engage with people who knew the land in their blood, in their moods, in their fingers, and to talk with them about what it was we were doing, and to understand that we could have a conversation.
Yeah, I think that the significance of that kind of relationship, that intimate knowledge of the land, is today, as modern human beings, we underestimate the loss that has in our lives. I was always struck by the artist, a comment that Andrew Wyeth made, the American painter, how I just make paintings in my own backyard in Chadds Ford, Pennsylvania, and in Cushing, Maine. I don't want my sensory perceptions to be watered down by exotic travel, and that always made a lot of sense to me. Though I've loved the travel that I've done, and I have done too much of it, but that made a lot of sense to me, what he said.
Well, he's talking about getting to know a place the way a farmer gets to know a field.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I can remember going to a talk. Remember, like, up toward the top of the village on the left.
Going west, or
going toward Killala?
Yeah.
Like, going uphill on the left, there was like a women's craft collective.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
Do you remember that?
They were wonderful. Yeah, they were so enthusiastic.
Right, and I remember, and maybe you were there. I can't remember what summer it was, but
it was like a green elementary school or something. It was the
right, something like that. I can remember going to an opening where they had asked who was then a very old man. He was the man who was responsible. He was the archaeologist from University College Dublin, who had, I believe, discovered Céide Fields, as an archaeological site, who may have been involved with the initial excavation. I'm trying to remember his name. He was quite old at that point, or at least he seemed it compared to my age. And I remember he gave a little talk. He was invited to give the opening talk, after everyone was gathered and, having a drink here and there. Someone rang a bell or something like that, and then he spoke for a while. And I can remember almost everything he said, but I remember he told us that when he brings his students up from UCD for the summer, and you might remember there was like a blue van that the archaeological students would drive around in as they went off to their work in the beginning of the day and evening. I can remember he said, I ask my students to take their shoes off and not to get to know the field, and not to get to know a corner of the field, but with your feet this summer, just get to know 1 square foot in the corner of a field. Just get to know what it feels like.
Well, of course, for you, this had maybe different motivations, but I think one of the greatest memories I had of watching you engage the landscape was actually from inside at dusk, looking out the big bay window in the rental cottage. Just looking at the ever lasting waning light, and as to be fully engaged and to know every little imperceptible nuance of that fading, disappearing light. You had little candles lit around you and you'd be sketching or making paintings, but you were just, kind of fiendishly, gently rocking, looking out at that view, just, listening and watching. And so that reminds me of this gentleman's urging of the students to know every aspect of that field. You were so devoted to trying to take in every aspect of that sky, which was quite
Oh,
something.
we each had our perches, I think, like our perches, like, where the bird sits and looks out.
Mhm.
And that window was such a great place to arrive at after having been outside all day long. I remember I used to come home and I would always go to Kalala to buy a thick piece of smoked salmon. Remember those smoked salmons they used to do? They used to smoke them in Kalala. And I would have a cheese that I got in Ballina. And I would go to Ballina, because I was selling paintings and I could afford it. I would buy really nice French wines. And I would come home and I would get ready. I would pour a glass of wine and slice some salmon, and I would have maybe some rocket from Ursula's garden, and I would set myself up with a little meal, and then I would just sit by that window from like 11:15 to maybe 12:30 as the cloak of night descended over everything.
Yeah.
And what happened, and then I would buy the altar candles from Brian, those tiny little candles, because you couldn't turn the lights on, because if you turned on the lights, the outside would be obliterated by the reflection. So I would set little altar candles up on the windowsill and even on my drawing board, and I would make oil pastel drawings. And we each had our perches, and we have this accumulation, like a Rolodex of such delicious memories.
Yeah.
So David, like, speaking of memory, how have you, like, what does memory become for you as a painter, as a person who's spending his days, like, what did you make of all that as you moved forward in your work? Like, what did this place, like, what was the huge takeaway for you from this place?
Well, first of all, I think it's necessary to say that I think the extraordinary opportunity and gift to any fellow who's invited to paint in Ballycastle is that if you're willing, it takes your arsenal of technique and preconception of what you think landscape is, and it just breaks it apart. It just stomps it out. And I think that I can think of so many artists who, after 5 weeks at Ballycastle, their artwork has made, their vision has made leaps forward. So given that, my work was never the same after I arrived with, I still am attracted to very strident kind of synthetic colors, but my sense of color took a nosedive after that first year in Halifax, where the muted tonality of my mixed palette was went underground. uh, but in terms of memory, I I'm amazed at, as long as I've been in this painting game and making paintings, how it seems just now that I am allowing myself to be guided by memory. I've been so orthodox about setting up my easel in front of the landscape, and like, slavishly, trying to uh, pay attention and honor it, as opposed to trusting in my own uh, memory and experience of what I've tasted over the years. And so honestly, I just think in the last 3 or 4 years, I still like to go outside and set up, but I'm really, in some ways, it's just a departure point. It just being outside, the scent of the earth, the weather conditions triggers those memories. And I just, my artistic process is an athletic operation, but so I like being outside. But I essentially just turn my back. I could just turn my back to what has initially triggered my imagination. But it's a real delight and pleasure to suddenly start to rely on my memory as a source of entertainment for recreating the experience of the sky and the earth and space and all of those things that Ballycastle taught me. Really one of the greatest visual educations of my lifetime was being on the northwest coast of County Mayo. That weather just was the greatest professor I've ever had.
Yeah, it was quite a teacher. Strangely, David, ironically, unexpectedly, we've both ended up in a very similar place with our work right now, in terms of what you just described with regard to memory and the turning of the back. I would probably say the very same thing, when it comes to what I'm doing. I mean, I'm not painting landscapes right now, but it's just interesting to me that at where we are in our experience and within our age, that we're working from a similar place in a certain sense. And this idea of turning the back to nature, I found that somehow in turning the back to nature, it allows me to come closer to maybe how the place felt.
Yeah.
Right.
And that reminds me of the simple fact is, and as artists, we're all just so overeducated. We've been exposed to too much about how to make beautiful paintings. What we forget is that we are nature. We are inherently nature, and we've forgotten how to trust in our intuition and our experience.
David, how does one learn to access that place?
I think I'm still trying to access it. That's why I said that I think the closest I came to making contact with the distinct characteristics of atmosphere and space in Ballycastle was at the end of the day, when finally I had just worn out my freaking ego, and I had gotten tired of seeing images of Cézanne and Corot and Courbet and Turner and so on and so forth. The whole history of the performance of painting flashes before you every day in Ballycastle. But I think, just the absolute astonishment and sense of wonder and just delight. Just I think allowing your emotions to take the reins and trusting that you're going to that you have the capacity to create a unified form that is an intelligent and sensitive response to that particular sense of place.
I think that, continuing with that thought, I don't know if before I arrived there in 94, if I had ever experienced the kind of emotional explosion in front of a landscape as I experienced that first summer. It was insane. Like I'd been painting in front of landscape already for 12 years, but I'd never felt that kind of intensity.
Yeah, and I think one thing that reflects that intensity, we haven't really talked about the ocean. One thing that is so distinctive about Ballycastle is that meeting of the ocean and the farmland. That's a very unique encounter, and that ocean was so ferocious, so whipped up. Going out to Downpatrick and staring off the precipitous 900-foot cliff into that seething swell, I was so beside myself. I thought the only thing I can do is jump into it. I can remember again being there with you, Pam, and the boys, and literally Pam just clutching on to your children lest they fall into those blowholes.
Total. Oh my God. Right. Like, can you imagine what that must have looked like from the point of view of a 3-year-old?
That was something that moved me beyond end. You'd go to the port of Kilcummin or Loch and Strand, where there were little ports for salmon, sea fishing vessels, and invariably you would see a placard with a list of sons and fathers and cousins, all from the same family, with a heading, another drowning tragedy. The Irish coast is merciless.
I imagine. Yeah, I think that every summer I was there was a tragedy of some kind between Ballina and Caratag, a drowning.
I don't know if you ever did this, but on a hot day in the summer, I would, I guess I was inspired by Michael John Burke, who did not have a bathtub in his house. And he said that, maybe, twice in the summer he would go bathe in the sea, and I just thought that was the greatest thing. And I would challenge myself with great intrepidation and fear. I would climb down the rocks into these tidal pools that were lined with seaweed, with unfathomable depths, and I would strip off my clothes and dip myself in and scrub my body but I thought maybe a monster would pull me down by the feet and I would never see the light of day again. But I just felt so alive when I would do that.
Totally. I remember you told me in the first summer that you were doing that, and I discovered the coast. I used to go like outside of the village on the way to Downpatrick. I would turn off the road where the 2-story house was, like on the way out to Downpatrick, and it was a lane, and at the end of it you could park fishermen. You remember there was a bay that had a stony beach, but then if you walked over to the left, there were the flat rocks that went deep out into the sea. And at low tide, it was fantastic because you could kind of slide off safely the end of the rocks into the sea. And from that point on, I would arrive in Shannon Airport. I would get the rental car and I would drive like crazy up, through, and in the last hour, it was through little dirt roads that I had gotten to know, through farmland. And I'd be driving like crazy because I couldn't wait to get there. It was like a teenager with a sex drive, I just couldn't wait. And I would arrive in the cottage and I would throw everything in and I would throw some boxes in the studio. And then I would drive out to that place, first day, right after arrival. I would park the car. I would walk to the flat rocks. Hopefully it was a sunny afternoon. I would take off all my clothes and I would dive into the water and I would get wet. And then I would just lay on the rocks and bake. And I felt like I had just taken like high mass, and eaten the host, like I had done communion. And I was ready now to face, like I was there.
Do you remember Lockenstrand?
Oh,
Going towards Kalala, about halfway. That was a real beach, and I used to hang out there. I remember, I think I was with you. Margot pointed us into the direction of a famine grave burial. There was like a big berm,
yeah.
kind of overlooking the beach, and you could actually, from erosion, you could see like
Skulls.
clavicles and
Right.
skulls and teeth. It was very powerful to make to go back into time and imagine this massive human burial.
Yeah. Yeah. Lacken was a whole other story. That was like, that was like a whole epic in itself, right? Like, I can remember the first glimpse of Lacken Strand in the sun coming downhill from the Ballycastle side. I mean, like the way it revealed itself, stretched out all of that pale sand and glowing and at low tide. It was unreal. It was like everywhere we went revealed itself with a power that was kind of frightening.
And because it was the only real, of course, Ballycastle had its own little strand, but it was bonier, a little bit more hard scrabble. Lacken had it was a little softer. It was a little bit, had a broader stretch of clean sand. But because of that, when the light, as you said, would hit the sand, it had a pink golden color, which, it was kind of rare to experience a really warm color reflection in Mayo, but there you would get it. Right. And speaking of low tide, I would frolic in, the tide would go way out, and I would frolic in the water up to my ankles and go pretty far out, and which was really unwise and foolish. And I can remember on one occasion, suddenly I found myself, the water was up to my knees, and I was way out, and I started to experience that rip tide, and I was just like, with all my humanly might, it was like I was walking through concrete trying to get to the shore. And but that, there are signs warning you of such danger there.
I remember your description of that, David, quite well. And you're no mama's boy in your physique. And I remember you describing how you were working with all your strength, trying.
I was scared.
Yeah. I felt that once, not as extreme, but I felt it once, and it kind of puts the fear of God in you, so to speak. I mean, it's very real. Oh, Lacken Strand. I can remember the first couple summers were very warm summers. And I can remember so many days of just driving down to Lacken Strand for the sun and laying on the beach. And there would always be like a boat, like a fishing boat bobbing, not too far. And there was, on both, in all directions, the manifestation of the landscape, like the physical presence. I remember, like, if you looked over there, there was kind of a modest cliff. And if you look back there, do you remember the green farmed fields, behind us? And then over toward Kilcummin, it was something like everywhere if you sat or lay, every direction was kind of the most beautiful thing you could ever imagine.
Yeah, your description of that reminds me of that distinctive striping of the those long lines of cultivated fields
The
that
terraced hillside.
would massage the hillsides. I mean, that was extraordinary, and would just like someone took a toilet roll and just let it unravel uh, across the land right into the sea, and
Well,
lined up.
yeah, I used to lay on the beach and just look back. I'd have my pack under my head so that I could see, and I would just marvel at the geometry of those fields, the relationship of the stone walls, and how the stone walls were like drawing
Mhm.
in the land. It was
Yeah,
like,
that has something, that experience of those stone walls uh, is something that has motivated me to move, to choose the piece of land that I ultimately did here in Vermont. Of course, there are probably many reasons why the Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire is called New England, but the early settlers were not unlike their ancestors in the UK, Ireland, sheep farmers. And throughout this landscape here, you have those stone walls, which always remind me uh, of those Irish land divisions, those barriers.
the land divisions were incredible.
And speaking of which, as you know, I'm like you and I have this kind of uncanny ability to poke around and sniff out little fragments of history. Every now and then I would poke around. I would see a broken clay pipe head stuffed into those stone walls. I mean, that was an archaeological museum in its, or display in and of itself. Was, if you studied the walls, they were stuffed with broken spades or implements or little twisted baling twine, old bottles. I mean, old shoes. It was so provocative when you have such a beloved relationship with a place, and a long time has passed, and you've matured and moved in different directions, and even forgotten a little bit about the place. Suddenly, you go back and get reacquainted, and I think that push that, the possibility of pushing that relationship to a deeper place is very foundation exciting. Was the result of their unique insight and vision, and it's a painting that is a masterpiece. I've got to
David,
I've got to run, but this was so much fun. Thank you. There wasn't a dull moment.
It's like speaking with you together. It's always a pleasure.